At the end of World War II, the various Axis powers were treated differently. Italy had switched sides, so they remained intact. Germany, along with Austria, was divided into 4 occupation zones between the British, French, Americans, and Soviets, with the capital cities of Berlin and Vienna also divided into 4 zones. Japan, meanwhile, had some land annexed by the Soviets and gave Taiwan back to China. But in its home islands, they simply had a single American occupation zone. Well, okay, on the surface that is mostly true, and usually we like to quickly move on to the more dramatic Cold War. But there is one aspect of the occupation of Japan that is almost always ignored. While yes, it is true the home islands of Japan were on paper a single occupation zone under American General MacArthur, it was technically designated as an Allied occupied zone, not American occupied. General MacArthur just happened to be the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific, so he was given the job, and as a result, American troops did most of the occupation. However, since it was an Allied occupation zone and not exclusively an American occupation zone, there was also within it an unofficial British occupation zone, or more accurately, a Commonwealth zone. We're going to learn more about this unofficial Commonwealth occupation zone, but first, I'm going to talk about this video's sponsor, Ridge. I've been sponsored by Ridge many times, but this time you have a special opportunity to not only get a new Ridge wallet, but potentially a Hennessy Ford Bronco. On the Ridge website, you can enter in without spending $1 for the chance to win a brand new upgraded Hennessy Ford Bronco. Or hey, maybe you're not into that sort of thing, so you could choose a cash prize of $75,000 instead. You get 1 bonus entry for every $1 you spend on the site, up to 1,000 entries when including custom Hennessy products, all with the same beloved features of being able to carry up to 12 cards in your cash as well as block RFID signals from digital pickpocketers. Use the link ridge.com/emperor in the description below to get 10 bonus entries into the sweepstakes and 10% off your purchase. Thanks again to Ridge for sponsoring this video. There has always been a debate on how much of Japan's surrender was based on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki versus the rapid Soviet invasion of Manchuria, bringing the fear of a possible Soviet invasion of Japan. But this video isn't going to look at how and why Japan surrendered, but rather what the Allies had planned for Japan's surrender. While Japan was a member of the Axis powers, not every Allied power was at war with all of them. Some nations only went to war in Europe against Germany and Italy. A few, such as Chile, only went to war with Japan. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan similar to Germany, and once Germany invaded the USSR and they got near Moscow, the Soviets weren't going to focus on anything else. They even famously helped save Moscow from falling by providing extra reinforcements from the Soviet forces that were originally stationed along the border with Japanese Manchuria. But by the time Germany's defeat was close and inevitable, the other major Allied powers had wanted to make sure everyone was willing to be at war with both Germany and Japan, and the Soviet Union was urged to forego their non-aggression pact and open up a new front with Japan. Throughout the war, the Allied powers had multiple conferences with each other, and after Germany's surrender in May of 1945, they had one final wartime conference in July and August 1945, known as the Potsdam Conference. One of the results was the Potsdam Agreement on August 1st, which involved agreeing to the post-war occupation zones of Germany and how they planned to denazify the region. But another event was the similarly named but different Potsdam Declaration that occurred a few days prior on July 26th. In it, the British, Chinese, and Americans agreed that Japan must unconditionally surrender. The Soviets were not added to the agreement precisely because they were still not officially at war with Japan yet. The Soviets at the conference did, however, inform the Allies that they intended to go to war with Japan in August. I bring up these events because one of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration is the intention to have the right to set up points of occupation in Japanese territory to be determined later by the Allies. This means the possibility of a similar occupation partition like that of Germany could have theoretically happened. On the internet, I've seen this map floating around of a supposedly proposed Allied partition plan of Japan, in which zones were to be occupied by the Soviets, Americans, British, and Chinese, with Kyoto and Tokyo each also having occupation zones. However, trying to find a source of this map led me to only a random online article, which itself had no source for this claim. I personally have doubts this would have ever been agreed upon, as not only were the Soviets not a part of the Potsdam Declaration yet, meaning they wouldn't have been included in such early discussions yet, But also, there are several documents and messages from American authorities, such as President Harry S. Truman, that were absolutely dead set at not allowing the Soviets to occupy any territory on the home islands. If somehow the atomic bombs never happened and the Allies were forced to invade the home islands, the Soviets did have plans for a possible invasion of the northern island Hokkaido, so perhaps they could have forced their own occupation zone. But we'll never know. Regardless, this map, while an interesting hypothetical, is not something I could find substantial proof for being a serious proposal. So for all we know, there was no official proposal for occupation zones of Japan. The proposal to have Japan's home islands under a single occupation zone under the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General MacArthur, was agreed upon by the United States by early August, and with Japan's surrender close by, the Soviets didn't object. Aside from being a little late to the party, there were two main reasons the Soviets did not participate in the Allied occupation of Japan. Firstly, they had managed to seize South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and the Americans were willing to allow the Soviets to fully annex them. Secondly, Stalin did not like the idea of any Soviet troops being under the command of an American general like MacArthur. China, meanwhile, was content with merely being allowed to re-annex Taiwan, and was much more concerned with resuming their civil war with the communists. France had to rebuild its recently liberated country back home, and was in no position to impose anything over the peace in the Pacific regardless. This meant of the major Allied powers, while the US would conduct the brunt of the occupation, the British and other British Commonwealth countries were the other major participants of the Pacific Theater who could supply men for the occupation. The British set up a British Commonwealth Occupation Force, made up of a mix of soldiers and airmen from the United Kingdom, British India, Australia, and New Zealand in early 1946, and on February 21st of that year, the first troops arrived in Japan. The BCOF was assigned an unofficial occupation zone consisting of the island of Shikoku and 5 prefectures on the western end of Honshu. Interestingly, their headquarters was at the port of Kure, less than 25 kilometers southeast of the recently nuked Hiroshima. There were approximately 40,000 troops involved in this occupation force, and at one point made up 25% of the total Allied occupation force in Japan altogether. While the US did occupy the great majority of the country, the areas occupied by the Commonwealth still had over 20 million people, so it was no small contribution. However, the British Empire was in a much more fragile situation after the war than the United States, meaning that this occupation force would quickly dwindle. The entire force was always under an Australian commander, and Australia by far contributed the most. India withdrew all of its forces in 1947 upon achieving independence, and by the end of 1948 all British and New Zealanders had withdrawn as well, leaving essentially only Australian forces, despite it technically still being a Commonwealth occupation force. Further dwindling numbers in the force occurred due to the start of the Korean War in 1950. Their proximity to Korea made them useful for air raids at the beginning of the war, and many soldiers were transferred to the front as well due to their convenient position. Luckily, the occupation of Japan ended up being a fairly easy task, and upon the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco in 1952, the Allied occupation of the home islands ended. The US would still occupy the Ryukyu Islands for several more years, but the Commonwealth occupation was officially over. What little was left of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force was officially placed under a new Commonwealth force in Korea. Overall, the British Commonwealth's occupation of parts of Japan, while not the most eventful or essential part of post-war Japan's transition period, it is definitely an overlooked one. It's an interesting detail of the occupation and another example of the effort from Britain's dominions in the war. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.